Hey gang, welcome back to another video. Now what do you do when Halloween is over but you're not ready to put those store-bought animatronics away? Well, if you're anything like me, you're going to turn them into a Star Wars prop. So in this video, I'll show you how to turn a dancing Halloween skeleton into a droid scavenging Jawa. So let's get into it. The base for this project is this dancing skeleton that I picked up on clearance from the hardware store for $20. And while it's nearly perfect in every way for this conversion, there's some functions that will need to be deactivated. This prop, when in Halloween mode, sings a song and has a bouncing jaw motion that won't work for this build. So I'm going to start by removing the motor altogether. If you cut the yellow and white wires towards the base of the skull, you should have enough wires to reattach it for use in the future. But for me, this will be a permanent conversion, so it's all got to go. The next thing I need to do is to disconnect the speaker wires. There's no simple way to overwrite the audio track on the circuit board, so clipping the wires is my best option. Next up, I remove the LEDs behind the eyes as well as the plastic eye domes. These will get sanded with some 220 grit sandpaper to remove the printed on irises and give us a blank canvas for our Jawa's glowing yellow eyes. And speaking of glowing eyes, the LEDs that come with the skeleton are a cool white color, but the LEDs that come with the Jawa costume I picked up are yellow, and they use the same amount of power. So I removed them from the costume glasses and installed them in the holes where the white LEDs were with a bit of hot glue. While I had the eyes out of the skeleton, I gave the face a quick coat of matte black spray paint to help darken the eye sockets, since I want to try and hide the skull as much as possible. And when the paint had dried, I reattached the wires using some Wago nuts, screwed in the backing plates that hold the eyes in position, and they were done. Now we can move on to the audio. Because I can't alter the audio that's preloaded on the skeleton, I'll need to provide an alternate audio source. So to give the Jawa his voice, I'm going to be using this small audio player and speaker. This kit comes with a passive infrared sensor, also called a PIR, that will trigger the audio when the Jawa moves its arms. And its audio comes from a small speaker that's controlled by a circuit board with a USB port for adding audio to the built-in memory. And lastly, a 5-volt battery pack to power the entire device. I ended up hiding the speaker inside of the chest cavity, but left the circuit board and sensor outside so that I can make changes without having to unscrew the animatronic. Once I've got everything in place, I'll plug in the battery pack and we'll add a bit of Velcro to prevent it from moving around. But I'll deal with that a bit later. Let's take a moment to talk about the costume. I bought this licensed costume online, and while it's not screen accurate, it's a decent option for people like me who don't have access to a sewing machine or a fabric store. But it's got a bigger problem. It's a bit too clean for my taste. So with a can of sand-colored spray paint at the ready, I dusted the bottom edge and the sleeves to give it a bit more character. Now this isn't necessary, but I think it really helps to give the costume a bit more of a custom look. The last part of the costume that needs some work are the bandoliers. The fabric versions that come with the costume are just flat out wrong, and rather than buying real leather ones, I decided I'd make them from some EVA craft foam. I created a pattern so that I could trace out the parts of the design, and then grab some 2mm foam and cut out the pouch pieces with a fresh razor blade. If you wanted to make one of these for yourself, I've left links to my patterns in the video description. Now typically I'd use contact adhesive to bond the foam together, but since this won't see a lot of action, I figured it was safe to use some hot glue. So I applied glue to the back part of the pouch and then glued down the side flaps before adding a bit more glue to the top flap and pressing it into place. I repeated this step 4 more times to have all the pouches I'd need for the first bandolier. Next up, I created another template for the backing strap and cut it from a piece of 4mm EVA foam, and could then hot glue the pouches in place along the top edge. Once those were set, I flipped the strap over and added some hot glue to the bottom edge and pressed them into position. With my first bandolier completed, I coated it with black Plasti-Dip to give me a good paintable surface, and then I applied some brown acrylic paint to give it more of a brown leather look. I started off with more of a dry brush approach, but quickly found that the paint was moving easily across the surface, so I went with a heavier application while still letting some of that black undertone sneak through. This gave it a much more worn look that felt more in the spirit of the original costumes. For an added bit of realism, I took some round head fasteners and pierced them through the foam to create the look of metal pouch hardware. This worked really well and gave the piece a lot more dimension, although I'll say the toughest part was getting my fingers back inside the pouch to splay the metal fastener legs. With that out of the way, I grabbed another piece of 4mm EVA foam and got to work on the second bandolier. This one is a bit more involved, but the longest part is creating these bullet holders. The main strap is made of 4mm EVA foam cut at a 40-inch length. Then I hot glued an 1 3/4 by 40-inch length of 2mm foam to the strap, using a small dowel to create a bullet-shaped void. Then I applied a second bead of hot glue on the opposite side of the dowel to press the foam into. Once it felt like the glue was set, I removed the dowel and repeated the process along the entire length of the strap. Next up was to add some fake pouch flaps. These were made with the remaining pieces of 2mm foam at both 7.5 inches wide and 4 inches wide by 2 3/4 inches tall. They were hot glued to the back side of the strap, and once the glue was set, I flipped it over, took a quick measurement to make sure I knew where the glue needed to go, and then glued them in place. Off camera, I cut and glued a few tab details to finish out the bandolier, and then it was coated with Plasti-Dip and painted just like the first one. The two bandoliers also got some Velcro attached to where they overlap to help lock in their position and make it easier to put on and off the figure. At this point, I'm in the home stretch and need to deal with the head. Now typically this would be some kind of mesh, but because the eyes are inset and my local fabric store no longer exists, I used another tip from Jim Hemmig and used some sticky-backed kinesiology tape to cover the head. In a perfect world, I would have used some strips of dyed duck canvas like I did for my Tusken Raider, but this tape will have to do. Plus, I can always go back and improve upon this in the future. When the face was covered up enough to not show the bone-colored plastic, I added a bit of foam pipe wrap around the biceps and forearms to help bulk out the proportions of the body. They're held in place with a bit of self-adhesive cloth tape, and as an added bonus provide a bit of texture which keeps the robe sleeves from sliding around and exposing the arms. And with that out of the way, I can put him in his robe. Now that our Jawa is dressed and mostly wired up, I need to cut a small slit into the robe that will allow me to pass the wires connected to the PIR sensor so that I can hide it in between the pouches of the bandolier. That way, when the animatronic starts moving, it will trigger the audio to play. I friction fit the sensor into place, but I'll go back later and add a bit of hot glue to make it more permanent. Now there's a few ways you could go about this to hide the sensor a bit more, but this seemed like the most straightforward approach. It was at this point that I realized this Jawa felt a little short. So I decided to cut 2 rounds of 2-inch thick XPS foam and glued them together with a bit of Gorilla Glue to act as a platform. Once the glue had set up, I made a quick outline of the feet to ensure that I kept a flat spot for it to stand on, and then I started to carve away at the edges of the foam with a serrated knife to help round it over. And when I stopped being stubborn, I grabbed my pole saw to finish the job. When I had the general shape I wanted, I grabbed a curry comb and started to refine the shape a bit more. My thought was to make this into a sandy, rocky platform, and so softening the cut edges was the best way to achieve that look. Once the general shape was there, I used a bit of 80 grit sandpaper to smooth it over, and then I applied some Drylock Original Masonry Sealer to everything. This will act like glue for the next step, coating the platform with sanded grout. I found a small container of sanded grout in the color Haystack at the hardware store and dusted it all over the wet Drylock until the entire surface was covered. And any areas where the grout wasn't sticking would get spritzed with water to help activate the grout. I repeated this step until the entire platform was coated, and then switched over to some Mod Podge Ultra and gave the platform a heavy coat, making sure to really dampen the grout since it needs the moisture to cure into a solid form. Once everything looked thoroughly saturated, I set it aside to dry and then could get a look at everything together. Now unfortunately, the eyes aren't quite bright enough to show up on camera in daylight, but they definitely look the part indoors. Overall, for less than $100, I'd say this is a pretty straightforward project that would make a great addition to any Star Wars themed space. So there you have it, the perfect Halloween to Star Wars crossover. I'd like to give a special thank you to fellow maker and Star Wars nerd Jim Hemmig for sharing his build and for being a great collaborator on this video. And you can see his project over on the Star Wars Room Builders group on Facebook. That's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. But most importantly, go make something.